Going Nowhere. Episode 6. Past Curfew.
Dude, your cat is just staring at me.
Yeah, sorry, it's my dad's cat.
I don't know, can we get it to leave or something?
Yeah, I can get it out.
What's it doing?
No problem.
I don't know, go away. Sorry, buddy.
Come on, there you go. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay.
My hands smell like garlic.
I'm proud of you for that.
I haven't eaten garlic.
Right. Okay. We're recording this episode of the Going Nowhere podcast fairly late, but I would like to welcome a very special guest that will be joining us for this case.
Hi.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, if you'll make me. Name, Scottie Walker. Sign, Aries. Hobbies include knitting, going on long walks on the beach.
In Indiana?
Going on long walks along the river.
Right. Then let's get on to our story this week. One of driving, disaster, and dismemberment.
Ah, yes. The 3 Ds.
Oh, Jesus. Okay, I don't know what that means, but okay.
Oh my god, you're so unprofessional. Just read your introduction.
Okay.
Go on.
As a
No,
child.
Seriously. No, go on. Read it in your spooky little voice that you used to keep from sounding like a 12-year-old.
God, I hate you so much. Okay. As a child growing up in nowhere, you're told not to play in the cornfields. Sleepover chatter told you it was because of the shadows that move of their own accord, weaving in and out of the stalks so it just looks like wind. You'd get whispers from older siblings about how you don't drive to the cornfields at night. Moonlight was unreliable, and the last thing you could want is to get caught out there without a light source. Which, of course, is ridiculous. The farms that can afford it host corn mazes every year. Growing up, I can remember the feeling of hiking through those sprawling fields with Charlie, wearing a light jacket to keep out the chill of an autumn night. If we ever got lost, we could just cut through the corn, taking shortcuts until we found an exit. We'd celebrate, like we'd cleverly worked out the path ourselves, and she'd buy me a cheap styrofoam cup of hot cocoa, and we'd warm our chilled fingers by the large bonfire set up at sunset. Sometimes I can't help but wonder if we just chose the right cornfield to be in those nights. Or maybe the light of the bonfire was enough to keep us safe. But not everyone who goes into the cornfields comes back out in one piece. How much do you know about the Somerset Murders?
That's why you had me guest star for this one. Of course, I know the basics. I mean, it's one of the most famous unsolved cases of the 90s. 2 brothers, Daniel and James Somerset, and Daniel's girlfriend, Cecilia Atkinson, are last seen hanging out in Daniel's truck in the parking lot of Kroger. 3 days later, an unfortunate farmer stumbles across the remains of 3 bodies, though it looks like 5 given the state that they're in. What follows is the desperate attempts of authorities and amateurs alike to piece together the trio's steps leading up to their untimely demise, and a mystery that has remained unsolved for nearly 30 years.
Ooh, a zesty one.
A real zinger.
Total zinger. Never made murder sound sexier.
Thank you, it's a talent.
Right. Like so many mysteries before, we had the edges of the puzzle, but the middle left blank. The full investigation is decades old, So for the sake of not repeating work already done for us, we are going to lay out the case in the most linear fashion that we can. Would you like to start?
August 30th, 1993. CCTV cameras pick up Daniel Somerset's black GMC Cyclone in the corner of a Kroger parking lot near a frozen yogurt parlor. Daniel, his girlfriend Cecilia, and his younger brother James Somerset all appear to be hanging out in the back of the truck. And if that seems odd to you, then you definitely haven't been a teenager in nowhere for a while. The truck stays parked there until around 10 p.m., and none of the trio seem distressed, anxious, or frantic in any way. At 10:05, a figure wearing a Brentwood sweatshirt that is assumed to be Daniel climbs into the truck and drives off. The fact that we don't know for sure if that figure was Daniel will become relevant later. There's a very large gap in time in which a few odd traffic cams catch the truck, seemingly on a route out of nowhere. They made one stop at a gas station about halfway between the Lawson farm and the Somerset residence. A friend of James, Alex Miller, said that he pulled up while they were there and said a brief hello to his friend. Alex claims that James was acting extremely paranoid, physically jumping when Alex first said hello. The 16-year-old was known as being extremely amicable and had known Alex since they were in middle school.
Which honestly is one of the reasons that the Somerset Murders hit nowhere so hard. So many people believe in the just world phenomenon, that the world is fair and everyone gets what they deserve. When that is proven blatantly wrong, it jars us into the reality that we are not guaranteed anything. A cheerful college student, his girlfriend who had career aspirations in STEM, and the lovable social butterfly brother. We want them to succeed.
And that's why we know so much of what we do about the case. Alex could clearly tell that there was something wrong with his friend. After attempting to engage James in conversation multiple times, Cecilia apparently stepped out of the car and intervened. She asked what was wrong and apologized to Alex for James's behavior. According to Cecilia, the trio had just finished a scary movie marathon, which checked out as being a favorite of both James and Daniel. So he had to forgive James for being a little jumpy. Alex politely backed down and watched as the trio piled back in and drove off. What happened next is why Alex quickly becomes the best person in this entire story. He phoned Marina Somerset, their mother, and told her what happened. In a later interview with investigators, Marina describes the phone conversation as tense. She had been expecting the boys home soon, and while they were allowed to stay out fairly late, the fact that they seemed to be headed out of nowhere worried her. It wasn't like James to be particularly anxious either, but aside from these insights, there wasn't much else Marina could tell Alex. She trusted her boys, and this was heavily out of character. After he had hung up the phone with Marina, Alex attempted to call James. When James didn't answer, he called Daniel as a last resort, and that went to voicemail as well. Meanwhile, the trio was filmed pulling out of a gas station parking lot, then disappearing down a side road. This side road had no cameras, as everything along it was either private property or houses converted into mom and pop shops. At some point here, they split up. One of them stashed the car. It was found 3 days after the bodies, parked near a dumpster behind a little tea shop on that side road. The owner of the shop, called the Little Wren Tea House, said that they were awoken around midnight to the sound of a car engine outside. Their apartment was just above the shop, so it was easy to stir them. When they looked outside, fearing an intruder, they just saw a teenage boy in a yellow striped shirt and a teenage girl in a black blouse exiting the car and beginning to walk back towards the road. The owner assumed, understandably, that the two were looking for a place to hook up. However, as they were about to head out to tell them off, they noticed that the pair seemed to be looking around, like worried. Before the owner could even get a name, the two hurried back towards the road at a pace described as forceful and intentional. Which is where we get to the close. You see, even though it was very easy to spot Cecilia on footage, James and Daniel looked to be indistinguishable from one another, except for the fact that James was wearing a yellow striped shirt and Daniel had on his gray Brentwood sweatshirt. The cameras record in black and white, but a short-sleeved shirt is still very different from a hoodie with lettering on it. While it's easy to think that James and Cecilia had parked the car and gone to meet back up with Daniel, that's impossible. Because James stumbled out of the woods on the other side of town about 20 minutes later, according to a resident of that area who had been outside fixing his car. The neighbor reports that he recognized the boy, who responded to the name James when called. That was all he responded to, however, and continued walking towards the town, and towards the main road that leads out of nowhere.
Oh, that's right. There was this big thing, Cecilia's parents insisted that their daughter was dragged along, and made a bunch of false claims about the Somersets having a history of bipolar disorder, which, besides being horribly offensive, had no actual concrete evidence to it. Only after the investigations didn't turn up anything for weeks, they retracted their original statement and admitted that Cecilia had been packing to leave nowhere. Her older sister came forward and gave her statement in full, saying that Daniel had proposed to Cecilia a few weeks prior, and they were planning on taking James with them when they skipped town.
You're gonna spoil the ending without even mentioning the best parts? Like the fact that despite the overwhelming conclusion that the Somersets intended to leave nowhere, the only thing left in the trunk was James's school bag, a few blankets, and a bag of essentials. Nothing from Cecilia. Nothing else that you would expect people packing up their entire lives to carry with them. Which brings us to our last moments with James. One last camera, fixed on a traffic sight for the exit out of nowhere, caught him walking towards the road, completely alone. The footage still exists if you care to take a look, and it is absolutely unnerving to watch. Because despite being alone, he appears to be talking to someone that the viewer can't see. I say talking, I mean yelling, swearing, waving his arms enraged before stomping into the Lawsons' cornfield and disappearing forever. Cecilia and Daniel are assumed to have joined up with him, but after being seen ditching the car, the only evidence we have of their whereabouts is two shadowy humanoid figures moving on the outskirts of that same camera around 1:23 a.m., walking into the Lawsons' cornfield.
And there they remained.
More like there they remains. I can't tell if that was taking it too far.
Let's say it was, for the sake of tact. After all, once they were officially declared missing persons, the town stopped altogether. Search parties were out every night, combing the cornfields with flashlights and dogs. The entire Lawson family was questioned thoroughly, but the expanse of their property meant that none of them had seen anything. Or so they claim. And then poor Eli Lawson stumbled upon the shredded remains of an arm on September 2nd, 3 days after their disappearance. The Nowhere Tribunal published a complete, albeit visceral, description of the crime scene, so I think I will just read that. What once was a face, an arm, a torso, was now reduced to meat and bone. Blood, having dried somewhat, was spread across the ground, drizzled on corn stalks and leaves up to a foot around the bodies. The bodies themselves were nearly unidentifiable, as the face, including teeth needed for dental records, were reduced to shards. However, tatters of clothing marked with the gray and burgundy of the Brentwood Area Community College gear, and pieces of scalp found along the outskirts of the crime scene, allowed the bodies to be identified as that of Cecilia Atkinson, Daniel Somerset, and James Somerset. Evaluating cause of death, authorities came to the conclusion that each one had been struck with a fatal blow to the head, bludgeoned one by one. There was another blood splatter centralization a few feet away, where it is assumed that one of them ran before being struck down. Then the killer dragged the bodies together and began dismembering them systematically, as to make them entirely unrecognizable. This doesn't explain why they would have left the clothes, which were obviously a dead giveaway, or why they did it in the first place. Which brings us on to our theories.
Honestly, the popular theory tends to be the one I lean towards the most. Yeah, I think in researching the case it became obvious that someone was trying to keep them from leaving nowhere. Maybe it was someone in the Atkinson family. But it was clear that they were trying to get out of there as soon as possible, and ultimately just couldn't get away in time.
Well, yeah, 100% I share that theory. That doesn't explain a lot of the different minute aspects of the case. Like the fact that they just left in a rush, after hanging out seemingly perfectly fine. I mean, it seems to me like they were trying to ditch someone. The switching clothes, splitting up, ditching the car, that's the vibe I get from the evidence we have. Obviously, it couldn't have been Cecilia. They were planning on taking her with them when they left. Personally, I believe they had the fullest intention of going home, and then were maybe confronted. While this doesn't explain everything, it's safe to assume that someone targeting them for specifically leaving nowhere would just accelerate their plans.
Yeah. I don't really want to lend that much airtime to the move offensive ones. Obviously, we talked about the Atkinsons slandering, but people also claimed that the boys kidnapped Cecilia, that Cecilia was sleeping with both of them and felt persecuted, but there's nothing to back them up. People have spent years trying to find new evidence or put more together, and this is all we have. A lot of the hack theories are used to excuse the fact that no one could get there in time. I mentioned how Alex was the best person in the story, and that's because his call to Marina prompted her to go out and try and look for them. She tried her damned hardest before they were even missing for 24 hours, and she still couldn't get there in time. It's terrible, but it seems like whoever was chasing them had no intention at all of letting them escape. So, that leaves the perpetually unsolved question. Who were they running from that forced them to hide in the cornfields?
Considering the fact that their bodies were found so brutalized, it almost becomes a what instead of a who killed them.
They wouldn't have gone through all that work to hide from an animal, though.
I never said it was an animal. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Going Nowhere podcast. Scottie, do you want to plug anything in particular?
Right. Again, I'm Scottie Walker. If you enjoyed the spooky stuff we've been throwing at you with less of the history and social commentary, I have a true crime blog called Oops, Who Did It Again? And yeah, I think that's all, Meg.
All right then. I'll sign off for now with a suggestion. If you're thinking of exploring the cornfields at night, bring a spare flashlight and some extra batteries. Whether or not you believe in urban legends, it's best not to be caught in the dark. Stay curious, Nowhere. Going Nowhere is a weekly mystery podcast produced by the Nowhere radio station. In this episode, Scottie Walker was played by Aaron Ray, at Aaron Ray VO on Twitter. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next episode. Rate and review us on iTunes or leave us a like. Your support genuinely helps. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Nowhere Radio. Check out the link in our Twitter for access to our Discord community. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.